Well, thank you, Ian. That was an excellent job sort of reviewing the components that make up the Power BI application. And as Ian clearly pointed out, it's not just a single component, it's a set of capabilities, both located on your system as well as in the cloud, that make up Power BI. So this next section that I will focus on is looking at those Power BI components and figuring out how to most effectively apply them in a MEDITECH EHR environment. And so when I say MEDITECH EHR, really, as Ian pointed out, we're talking about the data repository because that's the one open component of MEDITECH where we have access to the data for reporting and analytics. So it probably helps to start to look at what is the MEDITECH Data Repository. And before you use Power BI, it's very useful to understand what Power BI is meant for and how that would interact with a MEDITECH DR environment. So as I think most people who have worked with MEDITECH DR are aware, it's essentially a dump of the MUMPS hierarchical database that's used by all of the different platforms that MEDITECH has, whether you go back to Magic or current Expanse and anything in between. That database is a proprietary hierarchical database, and the data repository is a replication or dump of that data into a SQL Server environment to expose it so that it can be used by tools such as SQL Server reporting services Ian referred to, or Power BI, or many other tools, because it's a relational database. But it's important to recognize that it's not a normalized relational database. It's in a form that's difficult to use directly. And so that plays a key role when working with Power BI. And perhaps one of the most critical components is there's no what are referred to as foreign keys or relationships defined within that database. And Power BI is designed to work with either flat files or a relational database that contains relationships. So Data Repository does not meet that requirement. Because it doesn't meet that requirement, there are a few different options we have to link to the data repository from Power BI, basically to connect to the data, the MEDITECH data. The first is to go directly to the DR tables, and you see a big red no there because we strongly recommend not doing that because of the way of the structure of data repository, the fact that the relationships of the tables don't exist there. It is possible to construct those relationships in Power BI, embed it within Power BI in they have a Power Query editor that allows you to do that. But then all of that information is sort of embedded within the specific reports that you developed, and it can't be reused or recycled. So not an effective way to use Power BI with the DR. The second option is to construct and use SQL objects. And SQL objects are things like SQL views, SQL stored procedures, SQL indexed views. And what that does is it allows you to sort of construct those relationships that are missing from the DR within those SQL objects and then expose those objects to Power BI. And therefore, you don't have to construct that information directly within the Power BI dashboard or report that you're creating. And I'll talk more about that in the next couple of slides. And then the third option is to construct data models. These aren't Power BI data models. These are basically models that you build in your relational database or a parallel relational database to the data repository that are normalized. They do contain the foreign keys that are necessary for Power BI to generate the dashboards and reports effectively. And so the construction of models is another option, and then linking Power BI to those models. And we've seen both the objects and the models as options that are effective for different conditions. We'll talk about that more in a second. There are two ways using Power BI to import or to access data. When you're creating a Power BI report or dashboard, you are prompted, do you want to import data or do you want to perform direct queries to that data? So there are pros and cons to both options, but the default option is to import data. And I think Microsoft and Power BI are designed that way because, as Ian mentioned earlier, when the data is imported, it's extremely efficient to manipulate that data. And Power BI reports, as Dan will show later, allow you to dynamically make changes, add filters, and view the data from many different perspectives and visualizations dynamically. And when you perform a direct import, which essentially caches the data into the system, it allows it to be all of that activity to happen very, very efficiently. It also allows you to use the full suite of what's called data analysis expression, or DAX library functions, which gives you a lot of capabilities for how to manipulate the data once it's brought into Power BI. There is a limitation importing data, though. In the Pro, it's 1 GB size, and in the Premium, it's 10 GB, which are relatively large. But when you're, let's say you want to do analysis of your audit data from your MEDITECH EHR, you could easily exceed the 1 GB if you brought in all your audit data for the last year or even the last few months. It's quite possible you could exceed the 1 GB. So something like that, you might be better served to develop a report that uses direct query. Now, direct query, primarily, again, you would never use it directly against the data repository. Direct query you would probably use with a data model, the normalized data model that you constructed and you highly indexed, because as you're moving through that report, it's going to generate a lot of queries back to that data model, and it has to return data to Power BI in sub-second for every one of those queries. If it's not, then it's going to not be a very nice experience when you're working with Power BI. So direct query allows you to have much bigger data models. They could be tens, hundreds of gigabytes, terabytes if you wanted to. It also allows you to, well, I guess it gives you the ability to look at data in a real-time basis, whereas when you're doing a direct import, the data has to be refreshed at some regular basis. I'll talk about that in a minute. Direct query, you are basically getting real-time data. You're pulling that directly from your model. Now, your model would have to pull fairly real-time from the DR, which is near real-time from the EHR. So you're still a few steps removed, but it could be relatively close to real-time if you're doing direct query. Whereas data import, if you're in Pro, you're limited to every 4 hours how often you can update the data. So there are pros and cons to each, depending on the type of data, whether you're doing models or going against objects, and depending on the size of the data, the two key factors there. So going back to building objects, there's a few different choices there. SQL views, which are essentially virtual tables, allow you to basically link data from your data repository into a view and bring that data together, or it could be from a model as well, and access it through your Power BI report. And that's sort of access. You can hide the complexity of the joins or the reconstruction of the foreign keys that has to happen from your data repository with a view, but you're limited to just a single statement when you create a view. A SQL stored procedure is a much more robust way of getting at the data. It allows you to use the full Transact SQL suite and write code, basically lines of code that produce an output that is then used by Power BI in the dashboard or report. So that's a second type of SQL object. Third opportunity is to embed Transact SQL directly in your Power BI report or dashboard. We recommend not doing that. Again, you can sort of hide the complexity there, but it's not reusable. If you take a priority pack update from MEDITECH, the DR changes the schema in any way, you then have to search through all of your reports to update the code there, whereas if it's in a view or a stored procedure, you can simply search through those objects, and it's very easy to do in Microsoft SQL Server reporting services and make the changes there. So there are advantages of views and stored procedures over embedding Transact SQL. into the Power BI reports. So that's not a recommended solution. And finally, one thing to understand is the Power BI dashboards and reports are really not designed, even the direct query, not designed to sort of dynamically pass parameters back and forth. They're designed to bring in the data set and then really do the filtering on the client side, so within Power BI. There is a parameter capability, but it's not, there's not a great UI or user interface for updating those, like date ranges and things like that. It's a little clunky from Power BI, and it's better to just bring all the data in if you can, and then do that type of filtering within Power BI. Building data models, there are a lot of advantages to this. Again, if you're working with a very, very large data set, or another advantage of a data model is it could contain thousands of columns of data you could build in, or at least hundreds or thousands. When you're working with a SQL stored procedure or a view, as in the prior slide, you're likely going to limit that to some set number of columns of data. So you're basically going to build that data for a specific purpose, whereas a data model could be much more general. It could be the entire ED department, or all your quality data, or everything to do with scheduling could be constructed into a model. And then that gives you a lot more flexibility. Those people generating the Power BI reports have a lot more flexibility, that they have access to all of this data. It's already been normalized and it's easy to use within Power BI. You don't have to reconstruct how the data is related. You've already done that in this model that someone has constructed. I think the key point is, whether you're doing SQL objects, views, stored procedures, or whether you're building a model, you still need to have some expertise in the MEDITECH Data Repository to construct these objects, that whether it's a view, stored procedure, or building a data model, which is just separate, probably a separate database in SQL where you're updating information from the DR. In any of those scenarios, you need somebody who has that expertise to build that. But once you've built it, the person who is actually generating the Power BI report needs not be that much of an expert in data repository. They just have to know Power BI. And that's a nice separation, because technical people, somebody with a strong Excel skill set, can use Power BI. You don't have to be an expert in the data. One problem, Ian pointed out that the Power BI service lives in the cloud, and the vast majority of MEDITECH clients with which we work have data repositories that are either on premises, so in private internet, or at a client like Cloudwave or NTT, which is a private network as well, and not accessible from the internet. So Power BI does come, Ian touched on this briefly, with hundreds and hundreds of adapters, probably thousands of adapters by now, that let you get to common data, things like LinkedIn, Salesforce, even NFL analytics. If you want to have a team that you want to put together in your gambling or whatever, you have access to a lot of analytics directly from Power BI through these adapters that they make available to you. However, one adapter that doesn't exist is one to the MEDITECH Data Repository. So because of that, you need to implement another component of Power BI called Power BI Gateway. And Power BI Gateway is essentially software that lives in your network, that exposes Power BI to resources, obviously securely, but to resources within your network. And those resources could be a SQL Server database that contains the data repository. And that's how we have it set up here. And that there are a couple of different types of gateways. There's personal gateways for those who are developing content. And then there are also sort of network gateways that allow access through secure communication to many people who are actually running the reports. So the end users, or the consumers of the Power BI reports, will go through that kind of gateway. And two examples of those are shown on the screen right there. But Power BI Gateway is something that does need to be installed. If interestingly, you can develop when you're in network using the Power BI desktop that Ian referred to. You might develop and the reports look great, you're happy, then you publish it out to the Power BI service, you go to refresh it, and it says it can't get access to the data. Why not? Well, you don't have a Power BI gateway. You need this gateway software to get back to inside your network. So after you've constructed all this, you've got your data models or your SQL objects, you've got your gateway constructed so you can get at the data, then what do you do with it? Well, what Power BI talks about are dashboards and reports. And the goal is basically to get information into decision makers' hands. And one of the best ways to do this is through a dashboard, which is really a summary of summaries, if you will. Reports can still contain graphics and visualizations. A dashboard is, think of it as a canvas or a palette that sort of gives a high-level overview of a particular business area or a particular service line, things like that. And so you have a dashboard. It may contain key KPIs, key program indicators, and performance indicators. It will likely have a lot of visualization so you can get a quick look at how you're doing in a particular area. And that could be things like, COVID-19 is a common one I think everybody is familiar with and probably seen some kind of dashboard showing COVID-19 analysis. There are things, surgical scheduling, emergency room, all of those might be areas where you have a dashboard. And then dashboards typically have the ability to drill down to reports, and reports can give you more specific data about what the dashboard is showing. So that's how Power BI dashboards and reports are used. I mentioned that when you import data, it has to be refreshed. When you use direct query, every time you're in the dashboard or the report, you are generating queries directly against the live data or the data model, and that data is updated sort of in real time. But when you're using the import, which is the recommended and most common way, that has to be updated. And if you're using Power BI Pro, the less expensive license, you can update as often as 8 times per day. So that would be every 3 hours, that's 4 earlier. And if you are using Power BI Premium, then that's the more expensive license, but still very reasonable on a user basis. That is up to 48 times a day. And so you can set that. This is an settings in your data set, which is a data set. When you import data, accompanies the dashboard or report. And that data set has settings, and one of the settings is to schedule that refresh. And you can see on the left is a refresh that's set once a day at 8 a.m. And obviously you can do it as many as 8 times a day. Power BI Report Builder is, again, Ian touched on this, so I'll go quickly through it. It's basically the way of looking at Power BI data through a paginated report, or one that's more columnar. It's meant to look more typically like a MEDITECH departmental report. One of the advantages of Power BI Report Builder is it does take parameters. It is a different technology than the Power BI dashboards and Power BI PBIX reports. This uses that RDL technology that's from SSRS, but it is part of the Power BI family, and I think it only was brought in a couple of years ago by Microsoft, and it sort of rounds out and gives Power BI that complete capability to do both analytics, visualizations, as well as tabular or paginated reports. So that's important to recognize that Power BI does now incorporate all of those components. One other feature of Power BI is it gives you the ability to have or implement pipelines so that your developers can develop, do testing through a quality control environment, and then have a production environment where everything that's been tested is then synchronized into production. So that is a nice feature. I won't go into a lot of depth on that, but it's built into the Power BI service, and you can use it or you cannot use it. But if you do use it, it does give you that ability to, through security, to have sort of one set of developers who are working in the development environment, a second set of people who are quality control, who then are turned over reports to validate them. And then once they're given the green light, you can easily promote that report or publish it to a production environment where end users will see those reports, either through what's called a workspace or through something that's called an app. And I'll cover that in the last slide here. You can share reports throughout your organization using something that's called an app. Power BI has, and the idea or concept of an app is very much like your telephone app, that you build these apps. They may contain a bunch of similar reports, related reports, and you publish them. And then as another person within your organization logs into Power BI service that Ian showed earlier, they can say what apps are available to me, just like going to an app store in Apple or Google. And they might see, okay, oh, somebody's giving me access to the quality apps, or somebody's giving me access to the COVID apps. And so they can then click on that and run those dashboards and those reports, again, all based on security, and even what they see may be based on security, but they are given access to an app also based on a separate set of security. So you have a lot of flexibility. Microsoft clearly is pushing apps as the way. It makes it easy for the consumer of the reports to navigate and work through the apps. It's also possible to give consumers access to reports directly to a workspace. And there's a relationship between a workspace and an app. Think of an app as a pretty overlay on top of a workspace, much cleaner overlay. And a workspace is a little more technical. And so if you give a consumer of a report access to the workspace, they're going to see a lot of buttons and options there that they may not need to see and may not want them to have access to. So that's why most people developing Power BI tend to recommend using the apps as a way of distributing the reports. It's also possible to embed a link to a report and share that on a SharePoint website or via an email within your organization. And then finally, another option is you can actually create a coded, like a QR, specific code that you can share to anybody outside your organization internet, which will allow them access to whatever you're exposing in the report or dashboard. And you might do this if you think of Johns Hopkins COVID dashboard. They're probably doing something similar to that, if you're familiar with that, where it's available to anybody on the internet, but they have very limited capability once they get in and how they can slice and dice and look at the data. And you can do that as well with Power BI. So you have a lot of different options for how you want to share that content throughout your organization. And you can see on the right side sort of some of those options listed. And in the center of the screen, there's this is the different apps. And here we have some clinical apps as well as part of our pipeline for that, showing you these apps, and a financial app as well. So that's a very fast overview of sort of how you use Power BI in the environment of MEDITECH and the MEDITECH Data Repository specific. And with that, what I will do is I will turn it over to Dan Dietrich of Northeast Vermont Regional Hospital, who will show how Power BI is actually used in practice. So without further ado, Dan.